Elizabeth Brunig's column on motherhood was all the rage on Mother's Day or Mother's Day weekend. And by that, I mean it evoked all the rage from blue check mark liberals on Twitter, some of whom literally get paid to be arbiters of gender equality and feminism. But when it came to the perspective of Brunig on motherhood, they certainly wanted to cancel it. Now, the headline for this op-ed was, "I became a mother at 25, and I'm not sorry I didn't wait." And so, in my opinion, true feminism believes in equality for all. It celebrates the freedom of women to make choices in their lives. Elizabeth Brunig made the decision to be a young mother, young by today's standards. And one person who seemed to be against that was Amanda Marcotte, who actually admitted that she didn't even read the piece. She says, "I would like to thank this headline/byline combo for helping me set a record for the quickest gross pass I've ever uttered in my life. The funniest part is framing 25 like it's some daringly young age. The average age of first childbirth is 26. She's actually not quite right about that, which isn't rare for Marcotte these days. The average age at first birth in the United States right now is 27, up substantially from 23 in 2010. Marcotte also says, if you want a take on this issue that is smart and isn't naked pandering to the fantasies of pathetic men, I recommend Jill Filipovich in her newsletter. Unlike anything Brunig writes, Jill actually respects women." So in other words, if a woman decides to do something that Marcotte or Jill happen to be against, well, then that life decision doesn't matter. I mean, that's true feminism right there. And how is making a decision in your personal life to have children at a young age? 25 is an adult, right? But how is that pandering to the fantasies of pathetic men? I mean, it's just ridiculous. And maybe before you have a strong take like that, you should just take a moment to read what the op-ed has to say. Because to be clear, Brunig brings up incredibly important points and a comparative analysis of the United States versus Nordic countries, where it's actually far more pleasant to be a parent. Pitting women with different perspectives against one another is not my definition of great feminism. Now, Jude Ellison S. Doyle, who I actually had the pleasure of not knowing the existence of before this, tweeted this: "Happy Mother's Day to Elizabeth Stoker Brunig, the only person ever to have given birth." And then Rasha Al-Akidi, "That title literally does not make me want to read it as a female who lived the majority of my life in a society that tried to convince me being an obeying wife and mother at 25 is all I should aim for in life. That's also a hilarious thread. Don't worry, Brunig has blocked me." Again, maybe read the piece before you have these strong thoughts. And the most vicious response came again from Jude Ellison S. Doyle, who said, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing this woman it was a tremendous personal achievement to be repeatedly knocked up by an internet troll she met in high school." Of course, she's referring to Matt Brunig there. I mean, these blue checkmark liberals seem to be pretty vicious toward the Brunigs. It's almost as if there's an entire cottage industry around it. Now, in reality, though, I think that there's an important takeaway from Brunig's piece, which I want to dedicate my Decode segment on. Brunig's column was about her experience and her perspective on motherhood, which seems to be condemned by the very, paid gender hustlers who just happen to have a different personal life experience or perspective. But more importantly, anyone who bothered to actually read Brunig's thoughtful piece could see that she raises relevant points about why it's so difficult to be a mother in the United States. So she writes that the case for young motherhood would be simpler to plead if it weren't for that particular back and forth. Snowflakes this, boomers that. Millennials stand accused of immaturity and selfishness, of lacking the grit and commitment to bring up children who, I gather, get in the way of avocado toast and grapefruit mimosas. She also says that as a rule, having and raising children is never easy. This is especially true in the United States, where compared with similarly developed countries, parents enjoy relatively little support. And that's absolutely true. We're seeing that play out in real time, where women in their childbearing age, for lack of a better way to describe it, are deciding to not have children because they don't feel they can afford it. They're drowning in student loan debt. They can't afford to buy a home. They can't afford to do very simple things that their families, their parents were able to do in the generations before them. And it's also worth noting that Brunig writes that young people are hesitant to start their families because of legitimate worries about money and stability. Pretty important point to bring up. And finally, one more excerpt from Brunig. She writes, when surveyed, most young people report that they elected to put off having kids because they wanted to make money first because of the high cost of childcare and the burden of student debt. Others cite the price of housing, political instability, and fear of a changing climate. And you know, it felt really good to read someone in the New York Times who understood me. Brunig has children. I don't have children. But to see her cite the list of worries that someone like me has felt good. It felt like finally I'm being represented in one of these op-eds when it comes to children, because lately all we've been seeing in legacy media outlets is the fact that in the United States, the birth rate has been declining since the 1960s, significantly. 6 years in a row, the birth rate has declined significantly. And in 2020, thanks to the pandemic and the fact that less women are willing to have children, the population in the United States decreased. But there's never really a robust discussion or explanation as to why that's the case. And one other thing that Brunig does that I think is important is she compares the United States to Nordic countries that are far more generous in their social safety net, far more supportive of new mothers, and make it easier to raise a family if you choose to raise one. Now, Mark Lino writes that, in the USDA, that middle-income married couple parents of a child born in 2020 may expect to spend about $284,570 if projected inflation costs are factored in for food, shelter, and other necessities to raise a child through age 17. This does not, by the way, include the cost of a college education. In fact, when you do factor in the cost of a college education, the cost of raising a child is nauseating. Let's watch.
It's $1.7 million.
$1.7 million. We looked at the Town and Country archives are an amazing thing. And in 1978, we did a story called From Birth to BA, how much it costs to raise, it was a young woman that we focused on. The price tag then, 1978, was $300,000. Today, we tallied it up, and it was over $1.7 million.
And that includes after-school classes, training or coaching to take the SAT, all these, programs that are associated with education that are meant to get children to the highest echelons of Ivy League academia. So it's important to mention that because not every parent can afford and not every parent spends that kind of money on getting their children to elite colleges and universities. But it is incredibly expensive, as you know, because we're grappling with trillions of dollars of student loan debt right now. I believe the number is up to $1.5 trillion of outstanding student loans. But in places like Finland, you don't have that problem. Education is free. In fact, public school dominates because fairly recently, Finland decided to outlaw and ban private education, forcing wealthier families to be more invested in public education, thus funding and supporting public education far more than they did before. With that said, Brunig mentions Nordic countries, and I'm assuming she's referring to places like Finland, when she talks about how the US places nearly all of the burden of childcare costs onto families. The American model is distinct and far worse than the Nordic model, where parents spend very little money in out-of-pocket costs during maternity, childbirth, and child care. Finland happens to be one of the best places in the world to give birth, and this video will explain why.
We have all kinds of benefits. We have benefits for children, benefits for illnesses, and pensions.
In 2019, Finland gave out 9.3 million euros worth of maternity grants. Thanks to Kela and higher taxes, childbirth costs are totally covered for Finnish residents. New parents may expect to pay for the hospital room out of pocket, but that's usually it.
When you go give birth, it's almost free. We stayed in the hospital for 3 days, 3 full days. As a family, we had our own family room and we got like meals and support and help and everything. And the bill was about 300 euros in the end, you know, for the whole. It's basically like living in a hotel.
It's basically like living in a hotel. And obviously she wasn't burdened by the insane astronomical costs of just giving birth. In the United States, though, the situation is very different, and it varies depending on a number of different factors. And so let's take a look at what the average American can expect in costs when it comes to just giving birth in a hospital.
I called the insurance company to get like a quote or an estimate. It was really hard to like get a number. They told me to call the hospital and just kind of went down a rabbit hole. So I didn't really have an idea, and I expected a lot more.
Dr. Michelle Moniz co-authored a 2020 study about the out-of-pocket costs for childbirth in the U.S.
In this study, we found that women's out-of-pocket costs for maternity care are rising over time, from approximately $3,000 at the beginning of the study period to about $4,500. It can be very difficult for patients to predict beforehand what they might be on the hook for in terms of costs. One really important finding in this study was that it's the deductibles.
Deductibles are getting higher, meaning people are required to pay more out of pocket before insurance kicks in. So even though the cost of birth has plateaued, the out-of-pocket costs are on the rise.
And guess what? Parents in the United States don't get much help postpartum either. So the mother gives birth in the hospital, in some cases gets slapped with astronomical hospital bills if they have a high deductible. And then as they're leaving the hospital, what do they get in support?
So what do parents in the US get postpartum?
A hat and a blanket. That was it, a hat and a blanket.
You get all advice, you get phone numbers you can call as far as lactation consultants and nurses that can help.
They gave me some like baby products and maternity care products, and the nurses are pretty liberal with like giving me as much as I want to take home.
I think I didn't get anything the second time because I was not at the hospital very long. The first time I recall distinctly getting the squeeze bottle and the extra mesh underwear.
But in Finland, the situation is actually very different. New parents are given what's referred to as baby boxes full of supplies that are so luxurious that they'll make the swag bag at the Oscars look like a complete and utter joke. Let's watch.
Today's baby box has 63 items for both the baby and parents. New parents can take the box or a 170 euro stipend. About 95% of first-time mothers choose the box. But the contents of the box are worth much more than 170 euros.
Because of the fact that there are companies competing with one another to include their stuff in that box, oftentimes, or all the time, those baby boxes are just equipped with really great quality stuff, whether it's clothing, baby bottles, things that the mother would need in order to help her in her motherhood. I mean, after giving birth, I mean, think about how incredible that is. Whereas in the United States, it really depends on which hospital you gave birth in. It depends on what kind of health insurance you have. There's no fancy baby box, and all you get is a number in many cases. And we love numbers in the United States. I mean, you don't like something that's happening in government, call your congressman. Oh, you're having trouble with something, call this person and get a free consultation. But in Finland, no, they actually get help with their material needs when it comes to parenthood. And that's an important takeaway that I think many people would be unaware of if we didn't have this opportunity to do a comparative analysis, which was sparked by Elizabeth Brunig's thoughtful piece. Now, in another way where families get no support is obviously with mandatory paid family leave. Currently in the United States, it's up to private companies to decide what their family leave policy is. If stagnant wages, by the way, are any indication of where executives' heads are at, you can get a sense of just how generous these leave policies tend to be. Now, federal regulations protect new mothers who might want to take up to 3 weeks of unpaid leave. As for Finland, I'm sure you're starting to notice a theme here.
In Finland, you get 10 months of paid parental leave, out of which about 4 months is set aside for the mother, and you start it before the baby is born, and then father can keep 9 weeks.
Typically, parents stay home for the first 3 weeks. They share the rest of the time until the baby is 9 months old. A parent can even stay home until the child is 3 years old and keep his or her job. However, the stipend is much smaller. In February 2020, Finland proposed increasing parental leave so the father's time off matches the mother's.
Can you imagine taking almost like a year of paid leave off to raise your family? I mean, it's unheard of. We're having ridiculous debates here in the United States about whether or not the Biden administration should expand childcare by a measly $225 billion. In Finland, they have this social safety net that allows people to have a family if they choose to have a family. In the United States, you have to factor in all of these issues, right? The cost of childbirth, the postpartum chaos that comes along with it, and the lack of support we get from the government. And of course, then there's the issue of childcare, because we live in a country where single income households are really a thing of the past. It's incredibly difficult to be a stay-at-home mom. Many mothers want to get back to work. And so in order to do that, they need childcare for their children. But childcare costs are crushing American families across the country.
Overall, the cost of childcare has roughly tripled since 1990, which is more than the overall rate of inflation. Today, it's a multi-billion-dollar business, and it feels like almost everyone is struggling to keep up.
A lot of other countries have different rationales for why they have childcare. Gender equity, preparing children for school, boosting the economy, whatever. The U.S., to a great extent, does not subscribe to those kinds of rationales.
In 1971, President Nixon vetoed a child care plan, saying it would weaken the role of family.
Both of these women in Los Angeles are on welfare, aid to families with dependent children.
In the 80s, government funding fell again, with a public backlash against the idea of welfare for low-income women.
These are all programs President Reagan says he wants to cut or tighten.
We will tighten welfare.
I thought welfare was already tight.
Today, the government covers less of the child care burden than it did in the 40s.
So as you can see, there are countless disincentives to having children. But the whole point of Elizabeth Brunig's piece was that she has gotten a lot of fulfillment out of being a mother. And I would suspect that there are many other women out there who would love to experience that, but are incredibly terrified by the fact that having a child could put them in bankruptcy. Having a child could mean not having the means necessary to ensure that that child has a healthy and prosperous life. And so, again, it was a thoughtful piece, to say the least. And the fact that people are coming after her because they didn't like the headline shows you the kind of ridiculous knee-jerk reaction that this anti-Brunig cottage industry is fully invested in. Now, the disincentives to having children partly explains the population and birth rate decline in the United States. In fact, the Associated Press reports that the U.S. population grew by the smallest rate in at least 120 years from 2019 to 2020, according to figures released Tuesday by the U.S. Census Bureau, a trend that demographers say provides a glimpse of the coronavirus pandemic's toll. So we had hundreds of thousands of Americans die from the pandemic. So clearly that's a giant factor in the decline of the US population, but it doesn't explain all of it. In fact, population growth in the United States already was stagnant over the past several years due to immigration restrictions and a dip in fertility. And the dip in fertility is significant. In fact, the birth rate measured as the number of babies per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44 has fallen about 19% since its peak in 2007. Just let that sink in. 2007 wasn't that long ago, but the material conditions of Americans has declined along with the birth rate. The birth rate was down 8% among teenagers compared with 2019, and by 6% among women ages 20 to 24. The rate among women in their early 20s is down by 40% since 2007. And the only group that did not see a decline in the birth rate were women in their 40s. And when you really think about it, it's because women in their 40s are more likely to experience some financial stability and have some means necessary to give birth to and raise a child in the United States. One small area of optimism does have to do with the Biden administration and his willingness to at least acknowledge the unaffordable nature of having kids. He implemented a generous 1 year, it's important to keep that in mind, 1 year tax credit as part of the coronavirus relief package and claims to want to make that tax credit permanent. But Biden is also proposing government spending to the tune of $225 billion for affordable childcare. And that's all part of his American Families Plan. President Biden's American Families Plan will ensure low and middle income families pay no more than 7% of their income on high quality childcare for children under 5 years old, saving the average family $14,800 per year on childcare expenses. The possibility of these proposals even passing is really a long shot. But even if they did pass, they come nowhere close, nowhere near the incredible social safety net provided by Nordic countries like Finland. But some wouldn't even be aware of that. We wouldn't even be having this conversation. We wouldn't be able to learn from countries that are doing things right if it weren't for people like Liz Bruenig sharing her perspective on the pages of the New York Times. Now, she's leaving the New York Times to go work over at The Atlantic, but she does fantastic work, and I feel privileged and happy that someone like her was able to share her perspective so we can have this conversation on this show. Don't let the blue checkmark liberals lead you astray. They have one goal and one goal only, and that's supporting and protecting corporate Democrats, and honestly, their role in diminishing the social safety net in this country. Nando.
Yeah, I mean, I watched that sort of mini controversy unfold on Twitter just in utter bafflement. The vitriol spewed at what was a perfectly, first of all, beautifully written, but also it wasn't dogmatic in any way. It wasn't like, this is what you need to do. It was just, anyway, it was just very, very, very strange. And you know, I often think about the tragedy in this country of raising children, because the people that I talk to who do have children, for the most part, everyone says like it's you know, it's given their life new meaning. It's just like the miracle of life. It's this kind of, you know, incredible thing that, you know, seeing yourself reflected back to you in a human being that you helped create. That contrasted with just the utter difficulty of raising children in this country, the lack of help that anyone has, obviously the costs, but not just the costs. Like you mentioned, it used to be where one member of the family could earn an income to support an entire family. That's impossible now. I mean, you know, women entering the workforce is obviously a good thing, but the fact that you need two people in the household to be earning an income just to scrape by means that who's going to take care of the kids? Like it, you know, it doesn't. Right. It shouldn't be that it shouldn't be gendered. It shouldn't be like that women have to stay at home and raise the kids. But there should be the option of one of the two parents, be it the father or the mother, to stay home and watch the kids. Like that should be an option available to people. But it's just not. It's not for the vast majority of people, and that just makes things incredibly difficult. And it's funny because like. My decode this week also draws heavily upon a Bruenig family member. This one, Matt, but it does talk about a similar aspect in terms of the labor shortage. What he points out is that the disappointing jobs number was driven mostly by women dropping out of the workforce in order to go back and raise kids. It's not the generous unemployment benefits; it's the lack of childcare assistance in the pandemic. You know, obviously there's, you know, a lot of schools aren't open, and, you know, it's just hard. You know, what do you do with the kids all day? So it's a lot of women kind of dropping out of the workforce to take care of the kids. And it's because the United States just leaves parents out to dry. Just leave them out to dry. And I frankly don't know how anyone can do it. Certainly anyone, like any working class person, just how working class people raise kids. I just find, I don't have any kids, so I just don't understand how I would do it, and I don't understand how anyone else does it, frankly.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, like, you know, me and my husband have had conversations about it, and there's like a huge part of us that wants to do it. Like, we want to have a child of our own, but I hate the idea of waking up in the morning, dropping off my child in some form of childcare, if I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford it, and then not being able to spend any time with my child until I'm off work at 6 o'clock. Like, having children that have to be raised by other people because of how this economy is set up. It's really difficult.